Within that future, what kind of model can we adopt in that future, and what kind of hope can we expect? Now Thomas will be talking about a model that he has developed himself. Now at the beginning of the panel, Thomas, I think he left the Amnesty International 2 months ago. He used to work for them on communications. Since then, well, let me start from the beginning. He has been developing this method for a long time now. How do we convince people? How do we have their opinions changed? To what extent does what the human rights movement has done is working? All ways of doing things now, it's a matter of a new way of doing things. Speaking formally, Thomas is a strategy specialist who aims to create a difference by changing opinions. He has developed an approach that he calls hope-based communications that would make it possible for NGOs to create new narratives in human rights and that way win the debate. This is a solution, value and empathy-focused method. As I said, until a very recent period, he was a brand director for Amnesty International. Before that, he was at the Transparency International, the European Commission, and the public relations company Hills and Knowlton. He wants to create an approach that would make it possible for NGOs to give their messages efficiently.
Hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in Turkey, although I feel like I might need to confirm that we're actually in Turkey because it feels a bit more like we're back home in Ireland with this weather. Definitely feeling at home with that weather. I'm neither an expert nor a lawyer, but some of my best friends are lawyers, so I'm okay if there's a lot of lawyers here. I've been working to make the case for human rights for several years now and working to try to communicate, change people's minds. And about 2 years ago, I really got sick of losing, and I really came to the realization that anger and fear are not winning formulas. That when we fight anger and fear with anger and fear, we create more anger and fear. And actually that's not what we are trying to achieve if we're working for human rights. And I'm in this business because my personal motivation is I want to make sure what happened, the horror of World War II, is never repeated. But that argument isn't the right argument to actually achieve that. And probably many of you know it, but also takes a toll on us as human rights workers to be constantly feeling like we're losing and on the defensive. So this session builds on Chris because the key sort of point of I've set up Hope-Based Communications as a consultancy now because I believe that we need to not just be focused on the things going wrong in the present, but we actually can make the future, that we actually have that power to shape the future. And where I think we've been going wrong is we've been very focused on talking about what's going wrong today. And by doing that, we are missing, first of all, the things that are going well. Actually, a lot of things are going well. And a lot of academics have started doing research to show us that attitudes to women or LGBTQ+ people, there's just a lot less violence in our societies than there used to be, looking back over hundreds of years. But also human rights movements have been successful. But our job right now, as we see it, is focused on documenting the things going wrong. And so we naturally feel things are going wrong. But when you start applying the hope-based communications approach, I've found that it suddenly challenges you with very core questions. So is human rights about inhumanity? Is it about documenting the worst in humanity in this world? Or is human rights about humanity? About cultivating the best, the humanity within all of us? And actually that has with it some questions for our work. So, you know, the challenge for us is our old model of name and shame. How does that work when leaders are shameless? When leaders are without shame? When actually our shaming them is actually giving them more publicity and attention than they wanted? How does it work when their message is we live in a dangerous world, and our message is we live in a dangerous world? Looking at the refugee issue, for example, they said this is a massive crisis, and we said this is a massive crisis. Our solution was we need safe and legal routes to manage refugee flows. Flows, which we use this metaphor of natural disaster, of rising waters. What do you do when waters are rising? You build a wall. That was their answer. Populists offer this false promise of going back to a world that used to exist. And while we might have different ideas about what that world looked like, it puts a picture in everyone's mind. Whereas we're promising, although we don't actually say it that often, a better world if you respect human rights. But our audiences need a lot more help to picture that world. What does that world we're trying to achieve look like? I spent 2-3 years struggling at Amnesty International. Our vision is a world where human rights are enjoyed by all. So, you know, some people, Amnesty is being attacked quite a lot around the world. I'm sure you all know. And, you know, when someone sort of questions us or tries to smear us, our instinct is immediately to say human rights defenders are not criminals, or whatever their attack is. It's not true that Amnesty is Western. Amnesty is not Western, it's global. But we actually never would say, well, here's what Amnesty does stand for, because we've not really spent a lot of time articulating that. What we are trying to achieve is a world where human rights are enjoyed by all. It would sound a bit empty, right? What does that world actually look like? And so I've started asking myself these questions, and I came up across basically 5 shifts that I think we need to ask ourselves in everything we do. And it's not about hiring, we need support from communicators, but actually all of us, the experts, the lawyers, the campaigners, we also need to ask ourselves these questions. And so I want to take you through these 5 shifts that I think anyone can apply to their work. And so the first key one is moving away from fear to hope. And so, you know, when we talk about shaming, shame is actually based on fear. Shame is that fear of being made to look bad in front of other people. So actually, when we hope to achieve our change by shaming politicians for doing what we consider the wrong thing and we believe is the wrong thing, we're relying on fear, actually. How do we actually mobilize hope? And the key thing here is hope is not about optimism or positivity or being happy. It's a belief that tomorrow can be better. So hope is a smart strategy for change. Because why should someone join us if they don't actually think we can get something done? Why would you get on a train that isn't going anywhere? I'm going to very quickly speak to some of the neuroscience. Chris has already alluded to a lot of it, but there's a very basic principle here that's really important, which is that to really simplify how all of our minds work. This isn't a lawyer's mind or an expert's mind. This is every human being's mind. We have downstairs brains and upstairs brain. And when we as animals are triggered to have a fear response, we decide if something's dangerous, and if we see danger, we tense up. If someone sends you an angry email, you go into attack mode, defensive mode straight away. That's the lower part of that brain. That's where our anxiety, our worry, our stress lives. When you're telling your audience, look at all these terrible human rights abuses, imagine if that was you. So we have to protect human rights because it could be you one day. We're triggering that fear response. We live in a really dangerous world. There's all these bad things happening. Fear response. Most human rights people I speak to, when I think, like, what is the emotion we want to trigger in our audience? It's usually, maybe it's outrage at first, but when we get past the outrage, it's usually empathy. And Chris was talking about empathy is there at the front of our mind. It's the upper frontal part of the brain. That's a completely different part of the mind than what we trigger when we trigger fear and outrage. So if we want to trigger empathy for the people we're trying to help, we may actually be going about it the wrong way. Actually, empathy is triggered when people feel safe and comfortable. both physically in this moment, but also research shows when people feel confident about the future, when they have a sense of control over their future. So look at people who vote for Trump and Brexit, for example. You'll see them feeling really sick of government because they feel like things are going the wrong way and that they have no say in what's happening. But also, actually, joy and a sense of humor. So that actually brings a bit of a challenge for us. If the emotion we're trying to trigger is connected to feeling good, but our job is to expose all these bad things happening, how are we going to do our work? So I can flip over to YouTube. I'm going to show you. So I'm going to take you back to Chile in 1988, where the dictator Augusto Pinochet held a referendum. Did I get it right? Chris has been correcting my pronunciation. So the thing for me with hope is that actually hope is needed most in the darkest times. It's like the times we feel like we're in today. When we feel things are getting worse, it's like a bit like a candle. You don't light a candle when it's light. You light the candle when it's dark. That's where we actually need hope the most. That was the click I suddenly had as a human rights organization. I suddenly realized our job isn't to tell people how dark the room is. It's to turn on the light and show them how things can get better. So the Chilean human rights movement wanted to run ads. Pinochet ran a referendum, yes or no, to me, basically. And he gave the opposition 15 minutes of television time to run an ad around midnight. And they thought, the human rights defenders all came together and said, okay, we're going to run an ad about the torture, the disappearances, the people in jail. We're going to just show people in Chile just how bad Pinochet is and that they have to get rid of him. But the problem was Chileans were scared. They didn't believe that this was even a fair vote. They didn't want to go out on the street and risk their own freedom. They didn't believe change was possible. So an ad expert came along and had them run this ad. And so I'll just translate. We don't have subtitles. You don't necessarily need to understand the words. The message is Chile, happiness is coming.
Soy libre de pensar, porque siento que es la hora de ganar la libertad. Hasta cuando ya de abusos es el tiempo de cambiar, porque basta de miseria, voy a decir que no. Porque nace el arco iris después de la tempestad, porque quiero que florezcan mil maneras de pensar, porque si la dictadura pienso en el futuro, voy a decir que no. Vamos a decir que no, oh, con la fuerza de mi voz. Vamos a decir que no, oh, yo lo canto sin temor. Vamos a decir que no, oh, todos juntos a triunfar. Vamos a decir que no, por la vida y por la paz. Terminemos con la muerte. Es la oportunidad de vencer a la violencia con las armas de la paz. Porque creo que mi patria necesita dignidad. Por un Chile para todos, vamos a decir que no. Vamos a decir que no, oh, con la fuerza de mi voz. Vamos a decir que no, oh, yo lo canto sin temor. Vamos a decir que no, todos juntos a triunfar. Vamos a decir que no, por la vida y por la paz. Vamos a decir que no, Chile, la alegría viene. Chile, la alegría viene. Chile, la alegría viene.
So when Chileans went out and voted to get rid of Pinochet, they were singing that jingle in the street. So what this video did, what was not in that video? There were no human rights abuses, and there was no Pinochet either. There was no attacking the opposition. The basic principle in messaging is there's basically 4 quadrants. There's what your opponent says about you. There's what your opponent says about themselves. There's what you say about your opponent. And then there's what you say about yourself. And that 4th quadrant is often the one we forget to actually fill in. But if we don't talk about the world we want to see, then who will? And so what this ad did was it showed Chileans what freedom looked like. Without the dictatorship, happiness will come. It gave Chileans something to vote for. And also was obviously it also showed us that we're not missing anything in the 1980s, but people could see themselves in the ad. There were miners, there were people from all sorts of different walks of life, there were people hugging, people walking together. It gave people a sense change was happening and they could be a part of it. But above all, the key emotion you saw in that video was people were all smiling. And we mirror the emotions that we see in front of us. And so it also just made people feel good. And that's something we're actually forgetting. So going back to that brain science, how you feel is actually a political act. You can see, actually, I've started trying to ask people, what does that world where human rights enjoyed by all look like? And the drawings I tend to get, people holding hands, people hugging, happy communities, people eating dinner together. So actually, maybe we need a lot more of this imagery in our work. So we'll come back to that. The reason it's so important that we talk about the world we want to see is a concept called the Overton Window. So basically, you have ideas that are accepted, that are common sense in society, and then you have ideas that are radical. So it may be an idea that we would all stop driving cars, we would live in a sustainable society, that we wouldn't fly anywhere, we would take boats like Greta Thunberg. An idea that maybe people can go wherever they want, regardless of where they come from. We've seen in the last few years unthinkable ideas from the opposition shift through repetition, through being constantly repeated to people so that they start to accept them as common sense. And a lot of our side has actually inadvertently been part of that process. The human brain, when you see something that's really wrong or something you disagree with, through repetition, you start to get used to it. You start to accept it as normal, particularly if you see other people in your group doing it. So we are social animals. We accept what we see our group doing. So we've seen ideas that are really abhorrent to us shift to the mainstream. So, for example, in Denmark at the start of the summer, a social democratic government won an election on an anti-migration platform. The idea that the European Union basically would have a migration minister who's protecting a European way of life, whose actual job is sending people to concentration camps in Libya, would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. But it has shifted to where it's mainstream. So on the one hand, that's really depressing. But what we can take away from it is the ideas that we hold dear that are currently, we don't even say them because we think we'll lose credibility, that are considered radical or unthinkable. If we have a strategy to make people believe in them, we can shift the things that we most want to achieve in 2030, our vision, we can shift those to popular and policy as well. But we need to stop with the fear and attacking our opponent, and we need to start making the case for those things, talking about our issues, not theirs. And that's where we shift from, we don't abandon any of the things I'm saying we shift from, but we have to make the case for our solutions. I'm going to touch very quickly on, at the moment, all over the world NGOs are flagging attacks on civil society, human rights defenders. This is a video from Global Witness. The video is called Enemies of the State. If you took away the question mark, it wouldn't be a very good message. When we say human rights defenders are not criminals, in terms of linguistics, the word not doesn't have a very strong impact in the brain. So basically our audience are hearing the message, human rights, criminal. And research shows a lot of people think human rights is something that is for criminals, that it protects criminals. And this video actually says, heroes or criminals. We spend an awful amount of our time repeating the opponent's message for them. This is a wooden spoon. What's the first thing that comes into your mind when you see this? Anyone? Food? Cooking? Folklore? Anything? Anyone have anything come into your mind that's not food? So in Ireland, this is a symbol of punishment. So when you are a bold boy in Ireland, the grandmother, the mother, opens the drawer and takes the wooden spoon out and gives you a lash with it. Not anymore. We've had some changes in Ireland. But when I was growing up, I used to hear old people saying that the problem with young people today is that they don't get enough of the wooden spoon. So this is an example of framing. So basically, the words we use are understood by our audience based on their own life and associations. So even words like human rights, freedom, fairness, mean different things to our audience than we expect. So we think if we use neutral legal language, that it will be understood by our audience the way we mean it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So, for example, if we use legal language about, say, a treaty to limit refugee flows, we're encouraging our audience to think of people who are seeking refuge as some kind of natural disaster that's flowing towards them that you need to keep away with a wall. Deeper than this speaks to a certain worldview, a way of seeing the world, how things function, that underlies how ordinary people think, but also decision makers. So essentially, George Lakoff, he wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, because he's telling us, stop repeating your opponent's message. He said that conservative policies are pushed by a strict parent ideology. So the idea that you need a strong person in charge of your family. If someone's done something wrong or has fallen on bad times, they need to be treated strictly. So if someone's poor, you can't just give them money like universal basic income or minimum wage or a subsidy because they'll get soft. You need to be firm and tough with them. And we can see a lot of countries that have, a strong authoritarian leader. That mindset often underlies that and is present in their language. Whereas progressive policies are more likely to come from a sense of a nurturing parent. If the baby's crying, you don't just, one parent, the strict parent would let it cry. It has to learn that it doesn't get what it wants when it cries, but a nurturing parent might pick it up and make it feel better. And so these ideas are present when our audience make decisions. No matter what we do, those ways of seeing the world are always there. So what George Lakoff has said is, we often use the same frames that our opponents use. So they will say something. So, for example, last week the European Commission says, we're creating a vice president for protecting our European way of life. And then Mary Robinson, the heroine of the progressive movement, says, you know what the European way of life really is? It's blah, blah, blah. What we are reinforcing is the idea we're European and those other people are not. And as long as we stick to that frame, we're reinforcing that difference with people. So he says what we should actually be pushing is a belief, empathy, our responsibility to care for each other and hope. Whenever you trigger fear with your messaging, you're creating that underlying way of seeing the world that helps the other side. And actually, the more we encourage empathy and hope and our responsibility to care for each other, you're building the groundwork, the foundation for people to support the kind of policies we want. This is very important in terms of what are the issues on top of the agenda. And again, because we're so reactive, we tend to let the other side set what those issues are. So I've been working on human rights for a global organization, so I've spent a lot of my time working on refugees, migration, and abortion. I don't want to be working for abortion. Every woman should have the right to choose already. I want to be working on equal pay, ending domestic violence. But because our opponents go around the world funding campaigns, even in Norway now, on abortion, we end up talking about it. So here's the issues that Europeans cared about the most in 2014, the economy, healthcare. Here are the issues Europeans cared most about at the last European election, terrorism, migration. And so our audiences care about several different issues. The challenge is what's top of their mind when they go into the ballot box. And so we need to have to think about this, because when if we decide there's a lot of bad things happening on migration, we're going to have a campaign on it. And we're going to talk to people about migration non-stop. What about all those other issues? And if we're going to have that campaign on the terms of the other side, we're basically helping them put issues to the top of the agenda that are going to help them win. What we could do instead, and I thought it would be good to talk about this, seeing as, if in a way we're lucky we're not at a Fridays for Future event because of the weather. But the climate change movement, they spend a lot of time talking about fear and the problems, but when they're at their best, they talk about solutions. They make us believe in, say, windmills and alternative energy sources. And the most powerful thing they did, I think, by taking that boat across the Atlantic Ocean instead of flying, Greta Thunberg showed us it's possible. And I think that's why she got under the skin of a lot of right-wing commentators. She said, look, instead of telling people you should change your lifestyle, she just did. She just did and started doing that. And that's the challenge for us. How do we show with our actions that here's how our solutions work? Here's how we do it. So that also means living on our values. So can we spend a little bit less time criticizing the behavior we're against and a bit more time celebrating the things we want to see in the world? So this is a sculpture that's in the reception of Amnesty International. It's a picture of hands holding bars, and it's imagery we all use a lot. And we usually use this in the context of justice. Chris was talking about maybe instead of human rights we talk about justice, but there's a question that bugs me a lot, which is, when I start applying habeas corpus, this is injustice. That's what injustice looks like. Someone in jail holding the bars. What does justice look like? And if we want people to join us to fight for justice, couldn't we also show them what they'll get if they join us? Thinking emotionally, obviously we can't offer them joy now, but can we show them, like, say, someone's going free, the promise of joy if you get involved in our movement? So the Pride movement, for example, has brought about immense cultural changes. 20, 30 years ago in most of Europe, you could get arrested for holding hands on the street. Now almost every major brand is embracing this idea, this positive idea of pride, putting it all over their logos. And so there's a question for me about human rights, because right now people feel human rights something political and heavy. It's important, but I kind of want to keep it over there. How do we bring human rights to the position where pride is? And, you know, that didn't come naturally. They spent a lot of time saying discrimination against LGBT plus people is bad, everyone should have the right to love. But then they shifted a little bit, mainly driven by the United States. And they picked equal marriage as an issue because they wanted to change the idea that middle-of-the-road audiences had about LGBT people, to get them away from their stereotypes and actually make people believe this is about empathy and caring and compassion for each other. And that was essentially that also people who were not LGBT could see themselves in this struggle as well and play a part in making things better. How does human rights make things better? So instead of talking about human rights as something that governments give you or could take away from you, a threat, or maybe human rights organizations protect you from harm, how can we make human rights in future seem something that you yourself use to make your society better? So something that empowers people rather than something to be afraid of. In the corruption movement, for example, this is an anti-corruption protest in Brazil, and they used a broom, which is like a simple metaphor, right, of cleaning up government. Transparency makes things clean. And I've been really grappling, like, how do I tell people the story of human rights in a positive way? Why should people care about human rights? Without having to say, these bad things happened in the past, so we shouldn't do them today. How can we say, with human rights, we can get somewhere better? And actually, one of the things that keeps coming up all over the world is the idea that human rights is not about fighting, it's about building. It's about nurturing. And it's a completely different way of talking about human rights and about our work. And the reason I think it's important is because instead of threatening our audiences to get involved, or else bad things will happen that you'll feel guilty about, or bad things could happen to you one day, can we give people the opportunity to be part of something bigger than them, to be part of making change happen? And that's come out of a lot of audience research, that when people decide whether or not to get involved in a cause, their actual number one thinking is, how does change happen? And how can I be a part of it? And that's something, that's a part of the story with human rights. How does human rights change happen? Donald Trump, what he did very skillfully was take a slogan from Ronald Reagan, put it on a $1 baseball cap, and with that, give people a sense of belonging to something. That is a crucial thing that our opponents are very good at. It's taking people who feel that they have no place in this world, who feel out of control, feel lost. They feel like the story being told to them by populists is all of your traditions are being eroded by globalists and cosmopolitans. Hannah Arendt actually wrote that the foundation of totalitarianism is loneliness. So really at that basic emotional level, the thing, people who are lonely and they're giving them a sense of belonging to something. And if you look at the history of human rights organizations, it actually, Amnesty International grew with people forming little groups and writing letters. They had that feeling they were doing something. And I think that's something that's missing. Do you remember Angela Merkel said this in the refugee crisis? She said, "Wir schaffen das, we can get this done." That's that message we needed instead of build a wall. And so in New Zealand, can we mind heading back to YouTube? So in New Zealand, the Labour Party were getting their ass kicked every year for a decade. I'm sorry, I hope that's translatable. sometimes my Irish way of speaking isn't even translatable into English. I think it's the other tab. I'd already set it up.
Okay.
So about 8 weeks before the election, the leader of the New Zealand Labour Party said, okay, we're going to lose again. The polls show we're losing. And he was actually asked in an interview, like, how does it feel that you know you're going to lose again? You must be thinking of quitting. And he said, actually, yeah, I am thinking of quitting. And he said, actually, I'm going to quit because talking about, you know, humble leaders, he said, someone else should have a go. And Jacinta Ardern came along, and she had a really simple message, which was actually there were all these policies they'd been pushing, progressive policies, nurturing parent, caring parent policies, that audiences kept saying, yeah, we'd like to have this, but we can't trust Labour to get that done. You know, the other guys take care of the economy. So she ran this ad.
Now's the time we've been waiting for. This moment. It's an opportunity that we don't want to miss. An opportunity to build a better, fairer future for New Zealand. To improve our healthcare, to give everyone a voice, to grow our economy and respect our environment. They will dismiss our optimism. They'll say that kindness will stand in the way of progress. They will try to convince you not to rock the boat. But we can do better. Because it's time for better. Better schools, better transport, cleaner rivers and homes for all. It's time to look after our towns as much as our cities. And come the 23rd of September, it'll be time to vote. I am ready. We're all ready.
I don't know about you, but I just feel good just watching it. It's a lot like Obama's campaign. I have a theory that I want to do some research on, that actually every moment of significant progressive progress, every progressive victory was actually built on a hopeful message. I'd love if you can think, if you can summon the will to think of moments of progressive change in Turkey, and tell me if I'm right or wrong. But to me, this is the future of the human rights message. And there's actually a communications linguistic expert in the United States called Nat Shanker-Osorio, who said, actually, what we need from human rights is less a sense of despair and more a sense of, we got this. So our audiences, instead of being overloaded by, like, here's all the things that are wrong with the world, can we also tell them, well, actually, we've been working, human rights organizations have been around for about 50, 60 years. We've seen this kind of thing before, and we actually know how we should respond to it. Here's how. Here's how we fix this. Which brings me to, which one of those would you think is most likely, which one of these characters best represents a human rights organization? BuzzFeed, for example, when they think of their brand and how they promote themselves, they want to be the friend of their reader who's like giving them an interesting story. And I think, obviously, this might seem flippant, these kind of things, but as our audience member, there's a lot of different things happening in their life, a lot of different causes out there. Would you want to go and spend your time with disgust, fear, and sadness? I probably spent most of my career being Mr. Anger up there. And I'm not saying that human rights should not, sadness in particular plays a really important emotional role in all of these things. It's not just all joy, but we need some joy, or the promise of joy, that we know how to get to joy. We've done social listening. Now you can measure the emotions of discussions on social media. Discussions that use the words civil society, the dominant emotion is despair. Despair is not a formula for change. Despair is a formula for despondency, for staying at home and accepting the way things are. Despair is how you vote, you don't vote when there's a referendum on Pinochet. Joy is the emotion that gets you out. Joy triggers endorphins. So I never thought I would be one of those people who gets into running, but when I run, I get that hit of those chemicals in my brain, and I get addicted to them, and it makes me feel good. So does that kind of ad, like Jacinta Ardern, people come back to that. The pro-life movement in the United States, there's research that shows people didn't join it because they are against a woman's right to choose. They joined it because someone brought them into the community. There was a barbecue, and they made friends, and they felt they belonged, and the community pushed the values. And a lot of times we have a certain moral high ground with our values that we think people should just come and join us because it's the right thing to do. But actually, if our values are so important, maybe we should invest in a little bit in that community so that people build those values. So I'm just introducing you very quickly, how do we actually start making those shifts? At Amnesty International, we started using Facebook ads, which is really a very popular tool with populists. They use Facebook ads to give people content that will trigger fear, anger, division. And I feel a real sense of urgency that we use those tools. We can't just expose and say, here's ads Donald Trump ran saying that migrants are animals, because we're repeating his message. We need to be as good as they are at promoting hope. And so we ran animations at the same time as this one. We ran animations that were a more old-fashioned human rights message. But we started running messages that were focused on the idea of shared humanity. That is our key message. That's our value, our belief, is that we are all human, and that our goal is actually to bring out the humanity within everyone. And to me, yeah, I'll bring it up. So the key, to me, the future of the human rights movement is a movement whose goal is building empathy. So think about what we're actually trying to achieve as human rights organizations. What would the world be like when we decide we've finished, we've done our job, we can shut down? To me, that's a world where we're taking care of each other, where we have empathy. And so actually the sort of images we're using may be less the pictures of abuses, but images that we know will build empathy. So pictures of planet Earth have been shown to build empathy because they remind us that we're all human beings sharing this planet. The one last shift, which I'll only speak to very quickly, is what we can also do is have strategies when we're faced with dehumanization is rehumanize people. So what we need to do is look at the stories we're telling people. If we're going to focus on building that empathy, that sense that we're all human, we need to start showing stories that are about the humanity, not the inhumanity. So we have to actually, the underlying belief in people's minds, how does humanity work? Are we meant to be individuals who just take care of each other? Or are we actually a group? Is human nature to actually care for other people in society? And so there's more images of people coming together around the table, taking care of each other. I think the big gap, basically what we need to challenge is imagination. So that, we talked about, this is all about the future. We actually, if you think about it, it's very, very hard, soul-destroying work to go and document the abuses that are happening in the world, and we will always continue to do that. But actually, on a certain level, it's harder to think of how things can be different and better. And that's where we need to do, I think, a lot of work in the future. So I'll leave it there.